All right, honors bio students. This is Mr. Labonte. Going to go over evolution. Here's our requisite comic, little Newton and the apple reference here with Darwin and the monkey. Okay, so one thing to know before we start is this concept that evolution wasn't invented by Darwin as a concept. It existed for a long period of time. Um, Darwin and many other people were coming to an appreciation that the Earth was quite old, much older than it was thought with before, which was about, I think, 8,000 years old using the Bible. Um, and so Lyell published this book, which Darwin actually took on his voyage of the Beagle, um, thinking that the Earth was hundreds of thousands of years old. Um, it was common knowledge that these things called fossils existed, whether they were rocks or they were just weird things that God put in mountains to test our faith, was a point of debate. But it certainly appeared that there were skeletons of things like fish up in mountains, and that those fish no longer existed, so that there were representations of species that were not currently on the planet that appeared to have been on the planet before. And Cuvier is the individual that discovered this. This is the famous example, and this is a mastodon jaw and an elephant jaw here. And so the mastodon doesn't exist, and they're like, well, what happened to this thing? Similarly, you may know kingdom, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So you have Linnaean classification. So Carolus Linnaeus came up with this mechanism of organizing things, and that was based upon physiological similarities, and saying, well, things that are more physiologically similar belong in similar groups. So there is this concept of a tree of life, or that there is a connection between different organisms. And then also, just farmers, people all around the world, have been breeding animals for particular traits, like strong horses or meek lambs or whatever. And then finally, there was the concept of evolution, including the term evolution, which was identified by Lamarck. And Lamarck had two ideas. One was evolution or change, and the other was complexification, which I know that we've kind of addressed in our class when it looks at the idea of a planaria, right? So Lamarck's concept, which is, but neither of which are correct. The first, his idea of evolution is that use of a object enhances it. So for instance, if this giraffe stretched its neck more and more and more, it would pass that on. That would be like if you exercised your right bicep, your child would have a really big right bicep and a small left bicep. So that's one. And then the second is complexification. This is also not true, although more difficult to argue against, because it certainly appears that way when you say we're starting from single-celled organisms and then ending up with people, which are pretty complex organisms. But the idea behind that is the single-cell organisms have taken, basically they have covered all of the useful space. So if you want to compete with the single-cell organisms, you can't do that by being more simple, because they are the most simple organisms. So you have to find a new way to do that. And that means that you're complex. However, there are many, many examples in evolution where you have complex organisms that have created a new environment, and then simple organisms come in and compete in that environment. So that would be a simplification. That exists as well. All right. So all of this is going on before Darwin. So this is when Darwin comes around. And just before that, there's this guy, Thomas Malthus, and he publishes this paper, oftentimes referred to as the Malthusian catastrophe. And what he does is he makes this graph of food production, right? So this is this idea of this is the rate at which food is, we're We're increasing our ability to make food, but this is population. And the Malthusian catastrophe is this point right here when our population rate grows faster than our ability to make food and people start starving. And this was a very popular idea in Darwin's time. And it really gave Darwin the concept that sometimes, I'll try to change the color here. Sometimes you have a little piggy that is not going to get all the food it needs. So here's our little piggy right here, and this little piggy does not have enough food. Darwin's insight is that the competition that's the most intense is not from other species, but it's from the same species. So this little piggy is the example I want you to hold in your head. And this piggy is not worried about a wolf. It's worried about all its brothers and sisters who are much, much better at getting food than it is. And so the idea is we have more individuals than can survive. And I'll go over that in the next slide. So Darwin puts these ideas together and comes up with the theory of natural selection. And the ideas are that individuals show variation, variations inherited from parents, more individuals are produced than can survive, and if you can survive, if your variation allows you to survive, then that variation gets passed on. So these are the 4 principles of natural selection, and those things lead to evolution. So evolution is the result of natural selection. Here are some things that natural selection does not say. We already went over sickle cell anemia. It doesn't mean that the organism is going to be better. No one would argue that having a sickle cell disease is better than not having sickle cell disease. But it's an adaptation for a given environment, right? So in the high malaria area, it happens to be better than the alternative, which is getting malaria. But that's not necessarily a good thing. Additionally, not all traits of organisms are adaptations. So for instance, we have a blind spot right here in our eye. And the reason we have it is because all of our nerves go and they go all the way through our retina. I might talk about this more in class. But basically the eye is made entirely backwards. Light goes all the way through, hits it, and then the nerves come forward and bring that information that way. Anybody who would make an eye would not make it this way. They would make the nerves go that way. So just because we have a trait like a blind spot, it doesn't mean that that trait is good for the survival of the organism. It's not, doesn't mean that that's an adaptation. Certainly a blind spot is not an adaptation. It's a problem based on our evolution. Another trait, organisms evolve a trait because they need it. It would be great for the giraffe to have maybe 30 cervical spine, not 7. But both humans and giraffes have 7 C-spine. So just because a giraffe needs more cervical spine does not mean it's going to get more cervical spine. It just has to get them in a larger group, okay? We did not evolve from apes, but rather, here's a chimpanzee, here's our little chimpanzee, here's a person. Both of us evolved from some other bipedal animal, right? So that's what happened. And then finally, anything is possible. Not anything is possible. Go back to pandas. Pandas basically have 6 fingers. So they have 5 of them that are pointed up like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then the panda, and I will get to this issue probably in class, but the panda would have benefited from having a thumb. Well, its thumb had already evolved to be pointed straight up. So the only avenue that was left for the panda was to grow one of its tarsal bones, or sorry, its carpal bones out and around, so that the panda's thumb is an example of something that is an adaptation that isn't the simplest way to do it, because the thumb couldn't go back through there. This is an example of another kind of crazy thing. We have this nerve, the vagus nerve, that goes all the way down. It goes around our aorta and then up into our throat. All right, and so this nerve evolved because it started evolving when we were basically fish. But as our bodies changed, the nerve just grew and changed and moved around, so that we have this like strange loop. And then just this point that a theory is not like a possibility. It's not the way that we use a theory. A theory is an explanation of natural phenomena based on many, many, many observations. And we've been able to observe evolution happening. So it is something that occurs. Again, you don't get something just because you want it. That'd be awesome. We don't have that. And it's important to understand that we are not the top species by any metric. So, for instance, if you were looking at organisms that are successful, at some point it was thought that beetles made up 22% of the species. I've been really interested in this. There are these things called parasitic wasps. And now they're finding out that there's roughly about 3 parasitic wasps for every beetle. So parasitic wasps definitely appear to be the most successful organisms on the planet. And I just include this because it is by far my favorite comic of all of the comics I've ever included. I just can't imagine telling your son this, but I think it's so funny. Okay. So I'll move through these rather rapidly. This is evidence that evolution has occurred via natural selection. So in the fossil record, we have organisms that no longer exist, that bear a resemblance to other organisms that are related in both space and time, and then those organisms bear resemblances to organisms that exist now. So we see a pattern of physiological change over time. We also see that pattern change as environments change, and we see change in environment that leads to dramatic differences in the species that live in those. We also have a phenomenon called comparative anatomy. So even though humans, dogs, pigs, sheep, and horses all look very, very different, we all have the same bone structure. All of these bones are the same for us, and that indicates that we have a common ancestor. That's true as well for bats and whales and things like that. So this trait is homology, homologs. And it's important to understand this because there's another term I'm going to come up with. And so homo means the same. So these are the same physical structures. You can see this again, just other examples of whales and frogs. This is different than analogous structures. So the fin of a shark, the fin of a dolphin, that's a penguin, by the way, sorry, and the fin of a dolphin, they all look the same as fins. But the fact that they look like fins is not because of a common ancestor. It's because they are used for the same purposes. You can think about this too, like the dorsal fin in both a shark and a dolphin. These have no relationship to each other. So there's no relationship between these dorsal fins. But they look a lot the same because they're used for the same purpose. So instead of a common ancestry, you can think of a common function. And an analogy is not the same. And then more evidence, we have these things called vestigial structures. I just mentioned this because you should do this at some point. If you have the opportunity to look at a snake, you can in fact see the legs of a snake. So they're sitting right down there on the bottom. You can think of your own appendix, which is a vestigial structure that we used to use to eat things like grass. So there are a lot of them. Caseum and appendix are the same thing. And additionally, we have animals that basically have lived in similar locations that are more closely related, even if they look very different. So, for instance, the armadillo and the horse are more closely related than the armadillo and the pangolin, even though I understand they're all in the same class here. But it just is this really kind of interesting phenomena. So this is an example here of analogous traits. The armadillo and this pangolin look the same because they have the same functions. They live in similar environments, not because they are particularly closely related to each other. And the best example of this is what I call the marsupial train. So I'll talk about this briefly. So, there we go. 300 million years ago, I was about to say 275 million years ago. But about 300 million years ago, there were mammals on the planet. But these mammals were marsupial mammals. And what that means, here, is that they didn't have a placenta. And I think we've talked briefly about the placenta, but I don't know how to express this, but greatly helps O2 and food transfer between the baby and mom. So the function of a placenta is to aid oxygen and food transfer between the baby and the mom. It's a phenomenal idea. It's a great thing. But 300 million years ago, it didn't exist. So all of the different animals, all of the different mammals, let's say here's a mammal here, here's a mammal here, here's a mammal here, here's a mammal here, here's one here. All of the mammals that existed were marsupials. That's 300 million years ago, right? And then what happened at that point, 300 million years ago, is you had plate tectonics occur. You had a split here, you had a split here, and Australia and Antarctica started to kind of float off over here. And eventually Australia broke away from Antarctica and continued to float around. India moved over. It crashed back in to, I guess over here, crashed back into the Asian continent, right? But at 300 million years ago, there were no placental mammals, and you had Australia take off. All right. So Australia becomes isolated 300 million years ago. So we'll put a big A here for the mammals here, and we'll put a B here for other mammals. And we'll put a wall here. Well, what occurred here was the evolution of the placenta. So over here, some mammals evolved the ability to have a placenta. And that became very, very, very successful. So successful, in fact, that these mammals pretty much took over nearly all of the area for mammals, like all of the environments where you could have mammals. There are very, very few marsupial mammals on any of the continents, with the exception of Australia and some of the surrounding little areas around there. And Australia went off in its own way and continued to evolve. It moved up, it got warmer, so that Australia basically has a temperate climate where there are lots of different plants and things like that. And so there's the need, in terms of an opportunity, for a bunch of different organisms to diversify. And so what ends up happening is you have convergent evolution, and you have all of these mammals evolve to take advantage of the same environments. So you have the mole, marsupial mole, anteater, marsupial anteater, mouse, marsupial mouse, flying squirrel, flying phalanger, which is like a marsupial squirrel. So everything on this side evolved from a similar ancestor, but is taking advantage of an environment that's almost the same. And basically this place where this occurs and the line is called the Wallace line. So it's another famous evolutionary biologist who was a contemporary of Darwin and who actually came up with the theory of natural selection not quite contemporaneously, a little bit after Darwin did, and actually pushed Darwin to publish. So that's a really cool thing about contrivances, which is, so a contrivance is basically, it's a structure that was once used for one thing, and now it's used for another purpose. And the example here, that's super cool, if you can look at that thing, are these flying frogs. So these frogs can fly from tree to tree, which is evolution, which is much safer actually than getting down and crawling from tree to tree. They spend their lives in trees. And so the webbing between their feet, which was originally evolved for swimming, now is used kind of as wings that helps them glide from one tree to another. So this is a specific trait that's used for a new contrivance. All right, this is just asking you to think about whether something is a vestigial organ or a contrivance. Vestigial, contrivance. Wings is vestigial. I'll go, remind me in class, I'll talk about wisdom teeth. I can't read what that says. Hollow bones and flightless birds. Contrivance, spinal column with human discs. I don't know about that one. It seems like I do this all the time. Tailbone, vestigial, claws that grip rocks, lava rocks on the bottom, contrivance. That's not what they were used for to begin with. Petals on poinsettias, actually leaves, contrivance. Contrivance, and sightless eyes of cave-dwelling animals. It's vestigial organ. That's vestigial. We don't need that. We don't need that spinal column like that. That's like when we were fish. So this is just this idea that we are very, very closely related to these other organisms. If we have 99 the same amount of DNA as chimps, but they have 24 chromosomes. I think I talked about this in the other one. We had 2 chromosomes that got stuck together. All right, and then now we're going to look at how do we form different species. Okay, so I asked this in the activity that we did, but it's the difference between microevolution, which is change in gene pool, another which is the same as change, that's delta, in allele frequency, and macroevolution, which for our purposes, which is the creation of new species. Okay, so how do we move from microevolution to macroevolution? We can see that we're going to have specific variations in traits. Those traits are going to lead to better adaptations. They're going to be passed on, and so we're going to have different traits that occur. We've talked a little bit already about genetic drift in terms of allele frequency. So we understand that this happens. And so I'll give maybe just a brief example, kind of the classic example of genetic drift. So here's the Colorado River, which makes the Grand Canyon. Am I right? I think it's Colorado. Anyway, the river that makes the Grand Canyon. here's the south side of the Grand Canyon. Here's the north side of the Grand Canyon. That's, I think it's Kaibab squirrel. And this is another squirrel. They are separated by the river. And the river just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And we end up with this giant, huge canyon between these two organisms. They now can no longer mate, right? Because they are isolated. This organism is going to drift off one way. This organism is going to drift off another. So that eventually, when, whatever, we decide to put a giant bridge across the Grand Canyon or something, even if we bring the northern squirrels and the southern squirrels back together, they could not mate. And once two organisms cannot mate, that is speciation. And the reason that happens is because they can't exchange genes anymore. And so if two organisms can't exchange genes, that's speciation. How is it that that might happen? Let me give you just a brief, quick story. Let's say in the north, the climate was just a little bit different. And so the fruit or the nuts that grew mostly in October, right? So then the pattern of reproduction was focused in October. So these organisms only had babies in October, whereas these guys had fruit that was in March. So these guys started having babies in March. So they could be together. Every single thing about them could be the same in their physiology. But if these guys mate in March and these guys mate in October, they're not going to be able to have babies. Speciation would be the result. So when environments change, then the physiology changes in the organism and you get certain types of selection. So 3 types: directional, stabilizing, and diversifying. Directional selection is going to give the species favor basically a trait that goes in a specific direction. So if you imagine the classic example of this would be the industrial moths on beech trees in the Industrial Revolution. So it used to be the fact that these trees were white. Then the Industrial Revolution happened. The trees got sooty. So the white colored moths were favored prior to the Industrial Revolution. When the trees got sooty, then it became the dark colored moths that were favored, and that's directional selection. And there's good evidence that that occurred. And then actually, as we started to clean the environment up, those trees got cleaner again. And now the white favored moths are favored. So at first it went to the dark side, just like Atticus Skywalker, and then back to the light side like Luke. Stabilizing selection would be an example where both extremes would be selected against. So let's just say, the trees are gray, right? So you have gray trees. If the moth is too dark, this is my awesome moth, then that one would be more likely to be eaten. Similarly, if the moth was white, then that one would be eaten. So then that would be a stabilizing selection example. And then finally, you could, I'll stick with our trees. You could imagine a scenario where you had, let's say in England, they passed really good environmental laws. And so in England, the trees got cleaned up. But in Ireland, they didn't pass good environmental laws. And so in Ireland, the trees continued to get darker. And if that's the case, then you would have what's called disruptive selection. And the population of moths would be separated. And there'd be a pressure against the gray towards the black and towards the white. So those are 3 different types of selection that are going to lead to speciation. That has in fact been observed in the Galapagos with finches. It's a super cool example. I'm not gonna that was related to the drought of 1977. I'm not gonna go over that. This is the data that shows the movement of finch beaks. And then, sorry, I'm going to get back over here. This is where I was before I got to the selection, which is no more gene flow. Um, I think I'm going to skip this because it's not essential for your understanding. It's just adaptive radiation. Um, yeah, St. Patrick's speciation. No, I'm going to skip St. Patrick's speciation for right now. So this, I including this example just because it's kind of cool because it's a Northern California thing. So salamanders have been radiating down from the north over millions of years, but the Sierra Mountain Range is not a location, or actually the Sierra Mountain Range and actually the Central Valley, because the environment doesn't work for them, is not an environment where they can live. So the Sierras are right here, the Central Valley is here. The salamanders, as they radiated down, got pushed either to the coast or onto the wet side of the lower end of the Sierras here. And then by the time they got back down here to LA, they were two totally different species. So this is a geographic isolation that happened, and then you ended up with speciation because of genetic drift. And also, actually, not simply genetic drift, because you have some environmental changes here. But even had it not just simply been environmental changes, that you would have had speciation due to genetic drift. Okay, so the thing that I was kind of looking for here that I don't have is this concept of what in fact is going on. So I'm gonna skip lice, pubic lice, and body lice and head lice, even though it is phenomenal. This, by the way, you're like, gross, Mr. Levante, lice. This is how we figured out when humans started wearing clothes, because the claws of the lice change from holding onto hair to holding onto fabric. So it's just super cool. 72, like 60,000 years ago. Founder effect. So what happens with the founder effect, and there's an activity that we may do in class with this, is from an original population, let's say you have one person who has, and let's try to keep this with speciation. You have one person who has a beating red heart, right? So this individual right here has this heart that beats red all the time. And then this individual and these individuals go and they leave and they go over here and they go to a new environment where they can expand, right? This doesn't have to do it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with this individual's beating red heart, right? So this trait isn't being selected for, but it's just the fact that there's a lot of environment here that allows this individual to reproduce. Then that individual can have a ton of offspring that have a beating red heart. And you can, in fact, get so many offspring that have beating red hearts or whatever, that, assuming usually you might have two founder effects, right? You have a population that only has beating red hearts or majoritatively has beating red hearts. And then when they go back to the original location or the original island, this is that the image like 4 slides up with the birds, they're not attractive, generally sexually attractive, or maybe they're not capable of mating anymore with the people that don't have beating red hearts. And therefore, once again, you have speciation, because you cannot have gene flow between the two if they cannot mate. So species, now we're going to get to this. I think this is just examples of that. I'm going to define a species here. It's easier, I think, to do this way. Two different species are organisms, that's an E, that cannot produce fertile offspring. And the best example of this is a horse and a donkey. These are separate species. Now, the truth of the matter is a horse and a donkey can mate, and they will have a mule. So they're similar enough that their parts match. You can have insemination. The two haploid cells can meet. They can fertilize each other. You can have a zygote. That zygote can grow, and either the horse or the donkey, depending on whichever is the mom, come to full term, be born, run around, cavort in the fields with joy, but it will be a sterile individual. And if it is sterile, it means that it cannot recontribute to the gene pool. So the donkey gene pool is in a little box and it's separated from the horse gene pool, and you cannot have transfer of alleles between the two. And if you can't have a transfer of alleles, if the genes can't switch, then you have speciation. So that's why fertile offspring is really important. There's donkeys, there's ligers, right? Because there's a lion, tiger. That's another example. So all of that's there. So how could you do that? You could have habitat isolation, temporal isolation, I just told you about with squirrels that mated at different times. Behavioral isolation, this happens all the time with birds, right? If it has the wrong call. Mechanical isolation, right? If the penis won't fit in the vagina anymore. Or gametic isolation, if the gamete, the sperm, can swim but it can't penetrate the egg or dies upon penetration or something like that, then that would be gametic isolation. Or you could have post-zygotic isolation, which is what we just talked about with the donkey. Sorry, the mule. Or you could have reduced viability. So maybe you in fact even can reproduce, but you can only have like one baby compared to 100. Or you could have organisms that just die. So for all of these ways, this is how speciation occurs. And when you see examples like this and this is like the edge of speciation. This is just beginning to occur. An argument is that polar bears and like Kodiaks and other bears are doing that right now, assuming polar bears will even live. And then this is just a thing about mimicry that is super cool, but I'm not going to talk about it. This is why you should take your antibiotics to their full term. We don't have time to talk about. And the rest of this is human evolution, which we may talk about in class. So that's it. I hope this is helpful.